Hilligoss of the Berkman Klein Center, who will lead the session of flash presentations by the inaugural Techtopia cohort, a wonderful innovation on campus that Hannah also has a lot to do with. So just over to you, Hannah.
Thank you. So like Matthias said, my name is Hannah Hilligoss. I work at the Cyberlaw clinic based at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. And I'm really just here today to introduce these four brilliant members of our inaugural Techtopia student cohort. For a quick introduction, Techtopia is a new Harvard research and teaching initiative that I manage and was spearheaded by Jonathan Citrain, and was supported by over 35 faculty from across the university. Techtopia brings together this really diverse array of faculty and students around some of the biggest tech challenges that we're facing today, including some relating to the ethics and human rights implications of artificial intelligence. So today, the four students that we have here are from across around the university and are all going to be presenting on some research that they're doing that's related to AI ethics and human rights, but they are approaching these questions from very different disciplinary perspectives. So quick logistics. Each presentation is going to be about 8 minutes or so, and then we'll leave a little bit of time for questions after each one, and then quickly move on to the next presentation. So with that, I will introduce our first student. Josh Simons is a PhD candidate in the government department here at Harvard. He studies the politics and political implications of machine learning. He's currently working on what it means to justify the choices involved in machine learning in democratic life.
Great. Thank you. I don't know, do I need this? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I need to hold it, okay. So in many ways, this paper jumps off from where Solaiman's talk left off this morning, for those of you who were here. And I'm going to basically make 4 simple points during the course of this talk. I think you need to go at full screen, so I can, there we go. Ooh. Anyway, so the 4 points are as follows. The choices that you make in the process of designing and integrating a machine learning algorithm are political in some sense. And second, that therefore explaining an algorithm, or more specifically explaining a machine learning model, is not sufficient for actual accountability. Third, instead, actual accountability requires that institutions justify the choices they make in the design and integration of a machine learning model. And that fourth, this is an instance of a broader and more general point, political tools require political oversight. And since the idea for the whole paper came from 2 practical examples, I'm going to use those to make each of these 4 points. Okay, so point number 1, the process of machine learning is political. So I'm going to talk mostly about supervised machine learning, and you can think about 4 kinds of choices, just to lay those out to give you a sense of what I mean by it's political. The first is your target variable. That's effectively what you're asking your machine learning model to look for and to predict, rank, or classify. The second is your training data. This is what your machine learning model will learn from. The third is the actual model itself, whether you use a neural network, a decision tree, or so on. And then fourth is which features you want your model to use to predict the target variable you've chosen. Race, ethnicity, gender, user behavior, and so on. So let's go through these in each of the 2 cases I've talked about. The first is a sort of semi-fictionalized version of a real Facebook algorithm. It's called its Trustworthy Model. And effectively, the Trustworthy Model gives each user a trustworthy score. And that score is based on the extent to which your reported judgments about the veracity of a news article concurs with the community. So if your judgments about the truth of a news article align with those of the community, you get a high trustworthy score. And if they differ, you get a low trustworthy score. Facebook then predicts your trustworthy score on the basis of a bunch of features that they observe about your user behavior. So the important kinds of choices here might be, most obviously, the target variable, how Facebook decided to define trust, which is effectively the probability that a person's judgments about trust will accord with the community's. That obviously has a whole bunch of assumptions built into it, that trust is about consensus, and so on and so forth. The second is about the training data. Facebook used private messaging data to train this algorithm as well as public data. That again is a certain kind of assumption that it's reasonable to be using that kind of data when we're trying to assess the extent to which an individual's judgments about trust accord with the communities. Is it private or public? And then the second case I'm going to talk about is from Virginia Eubank's book, but a slightly updated version of the case. And I can't say the name of the county, it's Allegheny, I think, so I'm just going to call it AFST. But Allegheny County had a family screening tool, and the purpose of this model is to predict the risk of a child suffering abuse and neglect. Abuse and neglect is defined as call-in reports that the county receives about possible abuse and neglect in relation to a family. Call-in reports. So the important choices in that case might be, again, the target variable, the way that they defined abuse and neglect, which is effectively the probability that a family will receive a call-in referral report. But they know, and we know, that African American families are much more likely to be called in to the county than white families, for example. The second important choice might be again about the training data. The algorithm, AFST, uses data about families' interaction with welfare services in order to predict the probability of call-in and referral. They don't use private sector data. That automatically skews the data towards low-income African American families and away from wealthier white families. And another kind of choice that you might think about is whether AFST should exclude protected traits like race and gender, or, along with Cynthia Dwarf's talk yesterday, include them in order to be fair with respect to those characteristics. That's a choice, include or exclude. So, that's just an overview of why I think the choices that you make in designing and integrating a machine learning algorithm are political. So the second major point is that algorithmic explanation is not sufficient for accountability. And in fact, I think in some cases it may even detract and distract from it. So this whole paper came out of proposals, both real and semi-real, for methods of algorithmic explanation that I thought were not just neutral but dangerous. In Facebook's case, it was an interactive tool which would allow you to change certain features about yourself and then see how your newsfeed would look different if you change those features. So that might be your age, it might be your gender, it might be whether you like Barack Obama or Breitbart, and so on. And then up pops a completely different newsfeed that you would see were you the kind of person that you just change yourself to be, if that makes sense. And in AFST's case, Allegheny County's case, it was to give families with above a certain threshold of risk, a list of the variables that drove their given prediction. But because there are so many variables used in the model the AFST model, they have huge discretion over which variables to send the people the families that have just got a high risk score. So in my view, both of those are certainly not sufficient for accountability. They require too much discretion, and in particular, I think it's kind of a bit like if there's a car crash and you ask, why did the car crash happen? You don't want a kind of micro-physical explanation of the details of the particles that went on that do explain the car crash in a certain type of way, but it's an explanation at the wrong level. So that's the argument about why it's not sufficient for accountability. And then I want to say something even more than that, and slightly more than Solaiman said this morning, which is actually that I think sometimes there's something slightly more sinister going on, which in Facebook's case is, I think, fairly clear. When I put this idea of the interactive tool to my mum, she said, great, Facebook have really gone out of their way to explain to me why it is that I see the newsfeed that I see. But have they really done that? If they are simply developing a tool which allows you to change certain features about you and see how your newsfeed would look different, is that really a justification from Facebook of the way that they have set up the newsfeed ranking system? I'm not convinced that it is. In fact, I think it distracts people from demanding such an explanation, a justification, sorry. So, third point. I think instead, accountability requires a form of institutional justification. And in particular, what institutions have to justify is the choices that they made in the design and integration of their machine learning models. So if we go through our two examples to try and cash out what this means, in Facebook's case, on what basis did Facebook decide to define trust as the extent to which users' judgments of veracity diverge from the communities? And how does that definition relate to Facebook's mission to build community? And even more broadly, what kind of authority does Facebook have to define trust for that community of users? Is the fact that we sign up enough to justify our acceptance of that definition of trust? And what role has Facebook decided that it would have its trustworthy model play in its broader newsfeed ranking system? Does that model simply flag posts for human review, or is that model fully automated and that constitutes a decision? These are the kinds of choices that I think Facebook needs to justify above and beyond an explanation of how its newsfeed ranking model works. And similarly in CYF in the Allegheny County case, how does it define its primary duty? CYF always has a tension between protecting children and providing services to families. It has to take a line on where it sees its responsibility. Or does it see its primary duty as protecting against the most egregious cases of harm, or as reducing or minimizing the total number of any kind of harm? They would imply different things. And then, is it legitimate to define abuse and neglect in terms of call-ins which you know to be racially correlated? And should it only be using public data which skews the model in one direction? The basic overall point is that in the real world, institutional incentives shape the choices that are made in the process of machine learning itself. And it's those kinds of choices that I think have to be justified in high-stakes context. And so the final point is that I think this is an instance of a broader and more general point, which is that political tools require political oversight. And the great danger is that we delegate authority to make judgments about these choices to regulators, and that this in the end narrows the space for us to make collective political choices. And so the sort of overall question that I think this poses, that my PhD hopefully will think about a bit, is how can we live in a world of algorithmic bureaucratic complexity and retain the space for democratic political action?
Great, thanks, Josh. We'll open it up for about 5 or so minutes of questions. And if you could introduce yourself, that would be great.
Hi, so I'm Yan-He Xie at the Harvard Business School. If I understand your talk, explainability actually may be something of a distraction, and so we may not even really need to focus on it. Is that basically the way to understand? So if we think about, for example, Solaiman's earlier talk this morning, when he talks about documentation, right? That's sort of basically putting the algorithm within a broader decision-making process. What really matters is the overall legitimacy of the overall decision-making process, and the algorithm is kind of it may be a distraction to sort of focus on explainability. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So are there situations in which you can imagine not having explainability? How would you explain to somebody that not having explainability actually is better for the overall legitimacy of the process?
Yeah, so there's a couple of, one sort of minor point and then a general answer. The minor point is that partly what I'm doing is offering a kind of corrective to what I think is the wrong focus at the moment. So my point is certainly not that in most circumstances is any explanation required. But if we take Facebook's newsfeed as an example, when and to whom does it matter to understand the details, the internal logic, as Solon put it earlier, of the newsfeed ranking system? So I'm certainly not convinced that there is any clear user interest in understanding the internal logic of that newsfeed ranking system. There may be some regulatory interest in understanding the internal logic of the system, although I'm not even sure that's the case with Facebook's newsfeed. It might be true of a sort of credit scoring algorithm. So that's the sort of first step, and then the second step is if we focus on getting that from Facebook rather than a justification of why engagement is the primary metric and 4 or 5 concepts are the kind of qualifications to that primary metric, then we're basically not being sufficiently ambitious in what we demand Facebook to do. Does that make sense?
So there's no case in which actually would be better to have no transparency. I guess that was just curious.
Better.
Yeah, we actually. I'm just curious. I mean, you've thought about this, and so.
I guess at the moment it might be better not to have Facebook explaining the internal logic of that model, I would possibly say, just simply by virtue of the consequence that it ends up, meaning they don't have to justify it.
Hi, Vivek Krishnamurthy of several different hats. So at what level do you think political oversight should occur, right? So we can think of some kinds of algorithms where it's clear, right? Credit scoring, we have domestic law that governs banking, right? But when it comes to something like Facebook, it's not clear who should be doing it. The nature of the platform is global, right? So this is sort of the classic Cyberlaw problem of who regulates and how much. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so the first thing is I think that it's going to be nation states. I think the prospect of, I think it's neither desirable nor likely to regulate something like the content of Facebook's ranking model at any higher level than that. So that's one thing. But even within nation states, I think it's a really hard question because so you have Facebook subject to, without going into the details, you have some kind of regulator to which Facebook is subject in a way that it isn't now. So by what authority does that regulator get to make the kinds of choices that I just outlined are political? The obvious answer to that is that they got a mandate from a legislature of some kind. But that's a really deep tension. And the straightforward answer to that question within nation states is that I don't currently have an answer. But that, I think, is a really, really important question going forward, because at this moment of choice, what we risk doing is just delegating too much decision-making power over these kinds of questions to regulators and narrowing the possibility, our own possibility in the future, of having debates about these kinds of things.
Okay, great. We're going to have to stop there. This is going to go by pretty quickly, so I hope these conversations continue after the session. But I'm going to introduce our second speaker. Irene Solaiman is currently pursuing a master's in public policy at the Kennedy School. She is working on cybersecurity and elections with the Defending Digital Democracy Project and is interested in security and privacy in intelligent systems. Thanks, Hannah.
Can we get my slides? Logistical problems. Perfect. All right, well, those guys. Thanks. All right, so before I begin talking about AI, I would first like to talk about one of my favorite topics and a basic human need, which is food. And I will have to ask for audience participation, and all you need are your hands, and I like facial expressions, so if you have those too. So my first question is, how many of you were notified around Thanksgiving in the past month to avoid romaine lettuce? That's a good number. So thank you. Good facial expressions there too. And food regulations and regulatory bodies were established to prevent us from getting sick. And thanks to the FDA, many people, yourselves included I hope, avoided E. coli. Data regulations function very similarly. Our personal information, like food, is integral to our well-being, and regulations keep us from getting sick in different ways. In the next few slides, I'm going to explain why we need public-private collaboration and why now is the time for privacy regulations in the age of AI. However, regulation should spur AI innovation and not stifle it, as some would claim. So the first thing I have to talk about is what is personal data, and unfortunately, these definitions can really differ by culture, by regulation. It can be hard to pin down what people deem as important. And the definition will usually refer to what we ordinarily think of, like our name, biometric data, our fingerprints, our locations. But it's evolved to collect really personal information, like our brain waves or our heart rate. So another show of hands, how many of you have ever used something like MyFitnessPal or a Fitbit or something that monitors your heart rate? It's another good showing. And how would you feel if insurance companies started buying that information? And Not good? All right. Not what I was expecting. But there's another term for that I might think of, which is technically called creepy. There are other data points that we often don't consider personal data, so that can range from what kind of books we like to buy, or the frequency with which we contact certain people. And the notion of privacy rights are actually relatively new. They were first talked about in 1890 in correlation with new technologies where photography could surveil or collect information about people without them actually knowing about it. So that brings me to why data protection is important and why we need regulation. And part of this is it's considered secure information, and roughly half of Americans, about 49% according to a Pew Research study, feel that their information is significantly less secure than it was 5 years ago. We've seen an increase in data breaches, at least publicly. But part of that is due to individual cyber hygiene. So another show of hands, how many of you have ever publicly posted or tagged your live location? Interesting. No post on your live location on Facebook as well, something like that? Got a good cyber hygiene here. But that can also lead to actually burglary if you post your live location, someone knows you're out of the house. Fun fact. And another show of hands, who here has opted out of Google Live Location? I'm very impressed. I have not. So that also leads me to a lot of your personal data is just being given up. It's extremely valuable. It's hard to quantify the monetary value. You can connect it to what advertisers are looking for, how much hackers value it. But what the problem here is that the US does not have a cohesive and comprehensive national framework on privacy. There are several acts that span throughout specific sectors and states, but those can actually be conflicting or overlap in ways that aren't entirely helpful. So for acts like HIPAA, and you'll have to excuse me while I look through my alphabet soup, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act was one of the first privacy laws, but it can actually conflict with FERPA. Let me figure out what that is. Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which can actually conflict with COPPA, which is Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. So all of these regulations, while they're moving in the right direction, can be disjointed, and a lot of them were actually created in a time where data was not digitized, so they can be outdated as well. And one of the biggest problems is that there's little enforcement there. So most notably, one of the biggest data protection laws that we've heard of, most likely, is the GDPR. Affects EU members and EU states. And the crux of GDPR is that data belongs to the users. So you see my little guy, he's got his data running away from corporations. And we can look at all the new types of rights that the GDPR established, and most notably, because this is such a modern regulation, it actually refers to automated decision-making. And really, in Article 22 of the GDPR, it enforces that an AI is not able to be the sole decision maker in something significant like whether someone gets a loan. And failure to comply has heavy fines. It can be up to 4% of the last fiscal year's earnings, so that can scare some of the bigger corporations. There needs to be teeth to some sort of regulation like this. And how does this all pertain to AI? So AI, as you've probably seen in this conference, can come in many different forms. And although it is a buzzword, it is not new. It has existed for several decades, and I think I would at least attribute part of its hype to its advancement in another buzzword, which is big data. And any sort of intelligent system, in order for it to be intelligent, needs to learn, and it needs to learn from that data. So another show of hands, how many of you have used an AI assistant like Siri or Alexa? You are all contributing to its learning, and that can be really helpful, but that's probably not something that people consider when they ask a query. AI can process all this data, it can forget that data, but there are ways that it can store that data that we don't always connect. So for example, deep neural nets can implicitly store training data in their weights, which can be leveraged in something called model inversion attacks, where the attacker tries to recover the training data. And one of the main concerns about AI is what we call the black box problem. So in my very complex diagram here, you see I have data, goes into a mysterious black box, and then a decision comes out. And not entirely sure on how that decision is made, and I think we can refer to Josh's really awesome talk on explainability. How feasible is it? Is it really necessary? And how many people are really data literate? How can we expect that of people? But AI is beginning to affect more of our lives in positive ways, like credit card fraud detection, but also scary ways like biased algorithms, like Amazon's hiring algorithm that was biased against women. What is the impact on this? I'm going to talk through 3 different impacts on largely the tech sector and private enterprise, on individuals, and on the public, and what the US government should do. So in the past few months, there's been kind of a scramble to keep calm and comply with GDPR. It is estimated that Fortune's Global 500 companies will spend roughly $7.8 billion trying to comply with GDPR. So it does come at a cost, but why do we need it? There are relatively few pieces of literature on this relatively new subject, and generally the sentiment is that regulation is bad, it inhibits innovation. But this also raises a question on, is innovation the most important question that we have in technology? And should we just blindly be creating new technologies without considering the important harms and risks on society? So is this cost worth it? And I posit, absolutely. In fact, regulation can actually spur innovation, and in a meta way, there is a new startup scene that is helping companies become more GDPR compliant, so AI is helping AI. And regulation actually will help enforce transparency, which GDPR asks for. It's arguable whether that will help the average user, but that's one of the challenges we'll see in how we can create this regulation. What does that mean for us? The most important thing that an individual user can do is hone their cyber hygiene. Figure out what they're tweeting about, where they're posting their live location, whatever they're contributing to an AI algorithm. Are they consenting to that? Do they need to waive their privacy rights? Are they conscious of that? And then what does that mean for capital us, capital symbolizing capitalism and the need for public-private collaboration? And I'd like to draw us back to my favorite topic again, which is food. So to better protect personal data, the US must have a coherent and cohesive regulatory framework, much like how we regulate food. So there should be specific codes of conduct and labels. So we have organic labels that have specific rules on how that's determined. So what is safe for us to use? There should be quality control. So there's already laws that enforce that there should be nutrition facts, and you're welcome to ignore that, as sometimes I do. Or people should be able to access, it's part of GDPR, the right to access. And then a push to develop tools like security and fairness and privacy, but also it needs to have teeth. And the US government has an obligation to protect its citizens. Likely that will be in fining anyone who fails to comply. They can pay in whatever their local currency is, euros, dollars, bitcoins, wherever they live. But as I said, this does come with some high challenges. Here we have some code that replicates Jarvis from Iron Man. And part of the concern here is how readable is code for the average person? Does that disadvantage certain people? Is transparency absolutely necessary? And how willing are organizations to give up their source code? So thank you for listening to me talk. Hopefully I've helped you think, and I'm opening up for questions.
We have time for like 1 or 2 questions.
So I definitely agree with your conclusion that regulation is important. How would you recommend that political actors inform their their respective constituencies on the importance of data regulation, and perhaps make them more comfortable with the sacrifices that might entail for them in the service of building a more secure data environment for the general population?
That's a great question. I think that sparks the question, how do we get people to care? And especially in a time where we see large data breaches Are people really switching away from those platforms where the data breaches occurred? And I think that the social movements have been really powerful there and raising awareness. This is my thesis work, so I'm still working on what government agencies should be responsible. The Senate Commerce Committee is working on a bill on privacy, and hopefully the U.S. Department of Commerce. At the federal and at the state and local level, I think that also really depends on the state and their political figures, who is the most technologically literate. So there are a lot of different levels there.
Hi, Cyberlaw from the Berkman Klein Center. So the GDPR seems to have taken decades to develop from the first privacy laws in 1994. Do you suspect that also in the US it'll take an equally long time, or can the US also leverage the GDPR and skip several steps?
Yeah, also a great question and a huge concern, and part of what we've talked about here at the Kennedy School is the challenge between policy time and tech time. And I think what's really important about GDPR is it really improves on past regulations, like the former directive. And while it might take more time, I don't think time is a bad thing, because we do need to think clearly about what we're regulating. And there should be frequent and iterative updates. So yes, coming to that original framework will take time, but I don't suspect the updates will take as long.
Thanks, Irene. Okay, and now I will introduce our next speaker. Luis Valles is pursuing his MBA at Harvard Business School, and he is interested in the intersection of business, technology, and ethics. And he comes from an engineering background.
Very important fact. Yeah, in short, I'm interested in this question. Do recommendations on digital platforms erode our freedom of choice? And if so, what can digital businesses actually do to align their operations and their profits to these ethical questions? So to start from a very basic place, businesses use data to generate user recommendations, right? And Josh did a good deep dive into like examples on the news, on the feeds. And the question that I ask is then, how can we as users think better about what type of biases are being built into those recommendations? And one way that gets built, the bias gets built into recommendations, is the actual business model. A big point that Josh made is like around the data and the type of data that goes into the algorithms. But a lot of times it's the business model that defines what data is and is not being gathered at all, right? So a quick example is Facebook. The business model is built on a social platform where the users are essentially the same. So one user replacing another user, they interact in the same way and they have the same value. You can contrast that with Uber, where the business model is a two-sided platform. So now all of a sudden, on the platform, you have two different types of users, and the value that the network provides for each user could actually be very different. So I think this creates incentives for the business to focus on gathering one type of data over the other. A second way that bias gets introduced into recommendations is the algorithmic structure that a business can choose in how they process that data. A lot of talks alluded to these different types of structures. At a very high level, the whole purpose of choosing an algorithm structure and combining that with the data that the business gathers is to get to some sort of prediction with statistical significance. And this prediction is around user behavior or the engagement or satisfaction that users have on the platform to try to offer more personalized recommendations. Now, this becomes relevant because you can use different models to predict the same thing, and you can actually arrive at the same statistical significance level of prediction, right? And so if you only look at the numbers, you kind of say, oh, cool, so good enough. It's all about being able to predict better. But actually, depending on the method that you use, you introduce different types of biases. So I think that's an important nuance to capture. Okay, So how does this tie into the big question of how can biased recommendations erode my freedom of choice? And I know this sounds like a super philosophical, like high-level question, so I try to kind of bring it down to like my own experience. And essentially, I think it's important because it drives behavior. And when I think about what my behavior is in the future, I think it's a function of the choices that I make. And a lot of times those choices are anchored into my identity. Now, when I think about my identity in theory, it's like a combination of my past behaviors and the habits that I have, but also the future aspirations that I have for myself. And that's in theory, right? Because I think in the real world, there's all sorts of pressures, like peer group pressure, societal pressure, that kind of like sways you one way or the next. And when I was talking about some of these ideas, I actually drew a parallel to a personal example in my life, which was when I was in university, my parents immigrated from Mexico, and so like focusing on education and the value of education was always very, very important to me. So I was very intense academically, and I surrounded myself that shared the same values. And I did very well, and I focused, and I got good grades, and I got a good job. But when I got to the end of my university career, I kind of like took a step back and realized that in focusing so much like academically, I was actually kind of like limiting myself in a lot of other values that in dimensions that I think are important. So I asked myself just basic health questions like how much sleep am I getting? Am I exercising enough? Am I building meaningful connections with friends and family? And when I think about if I had an algorithm and an AI that I'm in close contact with every single day, and they look at the past behavior that I had for years, right? What might they do? And maybe they like introduce all of these ideas about the importance of like, keep focusing on like your career and keep focusing on academics. And maybe they might connect me with people that actually think exactly like that. And I think that's the risk that I see with these recommendation algorithms is they don't do a good job at capturing fundamental shifts in like priorities or when your aspirations for who you want to be change. And I think in that, thinking about it that way, like the pressure that you get from these ideas and constant bombardments, I think it actually makes it very difficult for you to change your own behavior. So to talk a little bit about what we can do about that, I think the solution requires changes on the business side, but also the user side. When I think about companies, I think that they need to actually start thinking about how can they design the fundamental business structure and how can they choose their algorithmic structures to limit this type of ethical risk. And I think Josh kind of alluded this as like it's important to change at kind of like the higher level, the systemic change. And I think you see these types of cases in business already. There's they do investments in like their digital infrastructure where they completely change from legacy technology to new technology. They invest in CapEx, which is like they're just to build new operations, right? So I think that this could be just another layer of consideration when they make those big changes. On the user side, I think it's also important for us to change the relationship that we have and how we assess the outputs from these algorithms. Because I think as much as I do feel the significant change will come once businesses better align their business models, I don't know when that will happen, right? And so that's kind of what I'm curious about and where I'm focusing on my research. And the way that I'm approaching this, I think you need to get out of kind of the classroom, and I think I want to partner with an actual digital platform. I want to focus first on the user side because I think that's the most accessible, and try to think of a way of how we can actually change this behavior and the way users are engaging with the models. And then actually meet them like face to face and see, is it working? Is this useful, right? Or to Josh's point, like, is this feature just getting you to actually stop questioning and thinking about the process? And then as a last step, I think I want to try to figure out a way for businesses to think, how does my business model and structure combine with the algorithm, and that combination introduce the ethical biases, and how can I kind of change my my internal decision-making process and decisions to just limit that risk. So, thank you. Yeah.
Yes, I'm Eric Blumenson. I'm a fellow at the Carr-Ryan Center. In terms of our decision-making, oh, thank you. In terms of our decision-making, it seems like there are two problems. One is the bias that the algorithms may have and lead you to a life that you might have chosen otherwise. But the other thing is the algorithm itself making decisions for you, and human beings losing the sort of ability to be making decisions for themselves. And I wonder if there's any solution to that problem, or whether you see it as a problem.
To the second one?
Yes. Because,
Yeah.
I mean, we no longer, just with GPS, we no longer are losing our ability probably to drive ourselves places without aid. And I assume that that can become increasingly common in all sorts of areas. We might, in a career algorithm, even if you get rid of the biases, you might simply still be deferring rather than being an autonomous individual leading your own life. That's my question.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I'm definitely not an expert in this, but the way I think about it is that it's almost like it changes by what decision you're making, right? Because I think if you go back to just way back in like time, since the history of humanity, I think technology scales like things that used to take us a very long time to make decisions, technology like decreases that time almost to zero, and it automates certain things. And in some situations that's actually desirable because it frees us up to focus on other questions, bigger questions, or more difficult questions. So I think that's just the nature kind of what technology is used for. So I think for certain cases, it will always be that way. But I think for certain decisions, maybe the risk is higher if you kind of outsource it. And I think when we think about like the users now, it's an interesting dilemma because maybe a lot of times the people that are making those decisions, organizations or businesses, there's varying levels of sophistications in how much they've actually like thought about that question. But in very practical terms, like we as users get hit by all of those choices already made for us, right? So I think when I think about like in an ideal world, every decision that has been outsourced would have been very thoughtfully made. And the ones where like we want to not outsource, that actually would never be outsourced. I think in a gray world, in a more practical world, like that, there's going to be varying levels of that. And I think in that world, when I think about myself navigating it, I think that it's actually, I need to be better at assessing which of those decisions are the ones that I actually don't want outsourced. And then which ones I can like recognize have been outsourced. And kind of like recognizing that mismatch. And then based on that, recognizing how I will respond to it.
Thank you. Philip Aaron from University of Connecticut. Thank you for this talk. I'm interested in your research, especially just thinking about my own experience with being frustrated with the browsing experience on things like iTunes. It just doesn't replace the experience of going into a video store and browsing, or going into a record store and browsing. And I think this is a big problem because I feel funneled in the way that you're talking about. Like my choices seem limited in a way that they didn't used to feel in a more analog experience. But I wonder if you can say more about what sorts of obligations or incentives businesses have not to restrict our freedom of choice. You seem to be operating on the assumption that it's they either have an obligation not to do so, or maybe even a business incentive not to do so. I wonder if you could just say more about that.
So if I understand it right, it's the incentive to not restrict, to like open up.
Like why would businesses not restrict my freedom of choice? If by restricting it, they get me to buy more stuff.
Yeah, I think the reasons why not would be driven by like consumer demand. Like I think now with like all this kind of like problems with Facebook and like the fake news and like the things that get funneled into our feeds and how that might be driving into like politics and other problems, I think that's like the user sentiment that like maybe now we are less, we're more angered like when that happens. And I think that that becomes kind of like a brand risk in a way, and I think that's where the incentives will come. I think the problem with that is that it's always like reactive, right? So that type of pressure only comes after you've broken something or like have made a problem that's like actually quite big. And I think that it's kind of dangerous to rely on that. But yeah, I honestly think like the flow is actually too restrict, because I think that's in double-edged sword. That is the value that these platforms offer, right? They say, you come into my music feed and I will see all the people that like the songs that you liked, and I can give you a song, and like, you might actually like it, right? It's more like the long-term risk of like being stuck in something that you like and never expanding out. But I think that right now, like the algorithms don't really capture that well. And it's maybe because people actually like it, right? So it's more like a long-term risk rather than like a short-term risk.
Awesome, thank you. Finally, we have Jenny Fan, who's pursuing a master's in design engineering at the Graduate School of Design and the School of Engineering. She's a digital product designer with a background in business and decision making, and is currently interested in interdisciplinary approaches for designing social computing systems. Thank you very much.
Hi, so I'm doing my thesis on designing a system of adjudication for online content moderation, specifically using computational models of distributed decision-making and novel advances in human-computer interaction, or HCI. And that's a huge mouthful, so think of it as digital juries for now. And I think this crowd doesn't need any reminder of the problems that mis, dis, and malinformation has pervaded in the public sphere. And for us, fake news is just one of the broader systemic challenges in our digital information ecosystem. Bad actors like disinformation, malignant bots, and trolls influence the healthy functioning of our information commons. And known bugs in the system, as ancient as our cognitive biases or as novel as our newer concerns of algorithmic bias, also influence the system and causes a lot of problems that we're seeing evolving on a daily basis. So although the feedback loops and many actors makes this complex adaptive system a little bit trickier than a simple tragedy of the commons problem, I think it might be useful to think about that model in talking about how to tackle information disorder in a similar manner through collective action and through regulation. So Lawrence Lessig's seminal book Code has offered a really great framework for regulation of cyberspace, and I've been borrowing from it very extensively and thinking about how to design tools for social content moderation. So many of these problems are market-driven, as Luce just mentioned, and structurally inherent in the business models themselves. Large platforms especially struggle because they try to be too many things for too many people, and they need to keep eyeballs on their platforms just to keep existing. And typically, the market does regulate in a way, and it has been. The PR crisis that Facebook is seeing is definitely affecting their stock price. And as larger social companies start to actively deplatform content like Alex Jones, they may find that that existing audience moves to smaller, more curated, and potentially more dangerous platforms like Gab, or co-opting existing ones like Discord. So law does offer some guidelines, as Irene has mentioned, notably Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which has a lot of leeway for platforms. And within private corporations, platforms will set standards that function as a kind of de facto rule of law in cyberspace. But that enforcement also varies widely and on a case-by-case basis. So Charlton Gillespie wrote a really great book about this called Custodians of the Internet, and he mentions this quote, every traffic light is a tombstone, and content moderation policies are similarly littered with the tombstones of past offenses. And just in the past few months, so much of this attention has caused a lot of collective organization from these big platforms, starting to develop a few principles of self-regulation, such as the Santa Clara principles, but that's just an early start. Which brings us to code. And code, of course, is the central point of Lessig's book around regulating the architectures that construct cyberspace, specifically because it's a uniquely human creation, and as we're increasingly realize, definitely not an apolitical process, as Josh has mentioned, no matter how much Silicon Valley wishes it could be. The fact is, all platforms moderate and all algorithms are designed. And part of this challenge is building these complex rule-based systems. Something like this, which might show how Facebook might decide if something is offensive or not, and can be really complicated. But in some cases, AI can be effective. According to Facebook, they're quite effective at detecting terrorist content, fake accounts, graphic nudity, graphic violence, etc., but notably very poor at detecting hate speech, partially because of how subjective it is. Zuckerberg has been reflecting on this extensively, probably for most of his waking hours in the past 2 years, and has also recently released a lot of thoughts around how they may start to de-amplify content, which conservatives would say is shadow banning and also an interesting ethical issue to think of in itself. That brings us to norms. A lot of the early internet was governed by norms, and there's been a lot of HCI research done in social psychology around norm formation online. And most of the research is not great so far. Computer-mediated environments just don't really translate social cues very well, although that may change with VR and more immersive technologies. But it's somewhat helped by group formation, especially around really targeted organized groups like many of the early BBS bulletin board systems, or the mission of Wikimedia editors. But even with platforms that do have norm-based systems, there's also the meta-moderation question. And what is the check on power of the fact-checkers? Facebook has been actively partnering with a number of very reputable international sources, but there are also conservative fact-checkers. What does that even mean? Or like the fact that there's a questionable epistemology on what truth is, it's a big bag of worms. Given this environment, I think this is a good conversation to have about the future of the Universal Declaration. And it might be a good time to think about what our civic duties are. After all, we live, we work, and we can study and hold our relationships online. We live online now, and what does a digital civics model look like? So I have a bit of a crazy idea, jury duty for the internet. The idea is very loose and still forming over this year as I'm working on my thesis, but I'm motivated by the question of how we can use social computing interfaces to build human-in-the-loop systems for content moderation. Around hate speech, questionable content, and borderline content, the effect is subjectively felt by humans and should be subjectively weighed by end users. What might a society-in-the-loop content moderation system might look like? It could sit on top of existing moderation systems where a user might flag something or an algorithm may queue something into a repository where the AI may then form a balanced jury, big asterisk, because what does that mean? Digital jury assembles, classifies cases, another asterisk, and potentially reaches a consensus on what something is. And that decision could be passed to moderators to do, asterisk, not sure, is it flagging, queuing, moderating, going through a series of versions? But the hope is that this human signal can be a feedback loop to help improve misinformation metrics and algorithms online. And there are a couple of variants, maybe not just moderating each piece of content itself around hate speech, like whether that attack might be Islamophobic or offensive towards minority communities or protected classes, but potentially you could solicit this human judgment for collaborative rulemaking or voting on policies that affect cyberspace. Could maybe norm generalization or sourcing ethical inputs. And potentially there's a lot of room to build and contribute this kind of data towards expert systems, be it expert AI systems or expert human systems. The idea has been done by MIT recently in their Moral Machines project, which uses test cases to source variants of the trolley problem across different cultures. And while the trolley problem is not something you exactly solve, there has been differences around individual cultures, and that's what really stuck out to me. The individualism and the various strains of how people viewed this problem reflect something in itself. We don't have a right answer, but it's very clear that we have different answers. As a UI UX designer, I've been looking into participatory decision-making interfaces. There's a company called Unanimous AI that is working on a swarm intelligence system that is kind of doing this Ouija board style, not blind voting, but iteratively going through and trying to pull a decision towards one direction, which I think is very interesting. And also there are, this is an example of models of computational social choice. This is an agent-based model around voting. I'm borrowing liberally from political theory, like Condorcet's jury theorem. Very much thanks to also Josh for suggesting that. And applying it towards agent-based models to simulate how these decisions could be formed. So there's a lot of research in this field, and I would really like to borrow from this field of academia and suggest implementations in practice. Before grad school, I worked in startups as a product designer for 5 years, and I've really appreciated this time at Harvard to actually thoughtfully consider the structure of how I might build the system, instead of just building it and waiting for it to break. So there are many, many, many remaining questions, but thankfully I have about 5 months to figure that out, and I am really open to any conversations that you would like to have on this topic. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Wes Adams. I'm a National Defense Fellow here with the Kennedy School, and the first thing I want to do is commend you. Great topic, and also a great attempt to come into a solution for it. And the idea of a digital jury to me is very appealing. I think it's a very good way to put a civic responsibility into this. I'm just wondering your thoughts initially on the balance between civic duty and then also First Amendment. Whereas for a traditional jury model, of course, there's been some type of criminal offense, and so it's a reactionary model. How do you put that forward in a proactive that doesn't conflict with freedom of speech?
Sorry, could I ask for a clarification? Are you thinking of the freedom of speech, like evaluating those cases, or the freedom of speech of the jurors?
Evaluating the cases. So if I have a First Amendment right to post what I want online, who are you to come along and judge me? That's sort of the very blunt end of that.
Right. So I think that might be looking at offline legal standards, and not all. There are exceptions in cases around the freedom of speech in the real world, and much of what I've been reading is that a lot of those hate speech cases and like potentially dangerous speech, or like the yelling fire in a crowded theater, those are examples in public space. But as we conduct more of our daily life online, how much of that gets translated to the online space? So that is kind of I think more and more platforms are moving towards like case law, case by case based way to kind of detect where those boundaries are. So while yes, freedom of speech is protected, there are also there's like the real world IRL laws, there's the platform digital world standards, and then there's jury input on what that might mean or register as in the system. So it's kind of a machine, or there needs to be a little bit of a due process to kind of figure that out. But that's what I'm hoping the juries could contribute towards.
Well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Amy Lair. I'm from a think tank in Washington, D.C. called the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and I'm the director of the Human Rights Initiative. And I just, especially I was just at an event at the Tom Lantos Commission on Human Rights in Congress 2 days ago, and I just want to reflect something I heard there, and I imagine you thought about this, but it's a question of speed, especially with hate speech. A woman spoke who was an Indian journalist who had basically like fake pornographic material put up about her, and it was within 24 hours. It had reached millions of people in India. So I would just urge you to think about, A, how do you make this speedy, and are there situations where there's no time for this deliberative process, and really being mindful about that.
That's a super good point, and because of it, I've tried to focus as much of my my work on scale as possible, and I think a lot of the platforms are also thinking about scale, because there's a lot of great work in deliberative democracies around these long conversations, and people arrive and they form and make a happier decision, but how do you like make that split-second judgment? So I think that's partially why I've been thinking about the interface decision. When you have this time period where everyone makes a gut reaction, that's like an interface that could be really modeled easily in a room where we're like, make eye contact, is this cool, everybody? And you can kind of figure it out. Like, how do you do that online? And this might even be like a stopgap solution towards a more immersive or more integrative version to make a, hey, is this cool poll? But yeah, the scaleness I think can be kind of mediated by the interface in a way.
Hi, my name is Juan. I'm a student at MIT. I was just curious about your implementation of this kind of thing, just because we do have a civic responsibility to attend jury duty, but we also have a legal requirement to do so. And I don't think that's something that can compel people if that's something that like a company puts forth for their own, let's say, program or system. So I'm wondering, how would you incentivize users to actually go through with this kind of online jury duty?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's on my list of many remaining questions. But I have been thinking about this a little bit. Like, does this exist on a platform level? If you have something like Facebook where there's so many people on the platform at any given time, you might be able to have an opt-in system. An early prototype might be volunteer-based. That gives me a lot of anxiety because there's a lot of biasing in who volunteers for this kind of thing to begin with. And also I've also heard like, who would do this? But a lot of the early internet had active moderators and people that are interested in voicing in their community. So given that it's a problem the platforms now have to deal with, perhaps one solution is they're actively trying to build out and recruit people from different voices. There's a certain localization where you might be asked to weigh in on a matter that is more relevant to your community. Thinking of the Burmese case, where now instead Facebook is spending so much money on Burmese and natural language processing, but like smartly identifying who is impacted by something. That also gives me anxiety because it's like, what is the group around that forms and coalesces? At what point do you arrive at a filter bubble of one? But MVP, I think maybe just volunteers.
All right, well, I just want to thank all of you and thank Matthias Rees for the conference and join me in thanking our speakers again.